Hi there, I'm Andrew. I am the curator of interpretation for Johnson County Museum, and we're going to do a little overview of our main tour today, talking about some things in our permanent exhibit, Becoming Johnson County is its name. So just before World War II started, J.C. Nichols and other developers were starting to create the first real suburbs. Places like Fairway, places like Westwood Hills, Mission Hills, some of those areas are really the first suburban developments of entire neighborhoods of Johnson County. And at that point, contractors were able to build between 7 and 10 houses per year because they had special craftsmen, people laying brick, people doing the woodwork, people doing the plaster work, doing the framing of the house. And so while they were building neighborhoods, they were only able to do as many houses as they had craftsmen. Other issues during that period were arising, right? The Great Depression was a major issue for the United States. Home ownership and home purchases were down. People weren't able to afford buying houses. Most people were struggling to be able to purchase necessities, to be able to live. And so Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration creates the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, in 1934. And the goal of this bureaucracy, this program, is to get more Americans in homes, owning homes. And so before the FHA existed, most Americans would have to put down 30 to 50% of the home and pay it off within 5 years, which is pretty unattainable when we think about home prices today. Same then, most people weren't able to save up that amount of money. The FHA did was basically flip those numbers. They said, okay, put down about 10%, 20% of the cost of the home and pay it off over the next 25 or 30 years. That makes home ownership much more attainable for lots of individuals. Coming out of World War II, we also see the VA, the Veterans Administration, and they created the GI Bill, which provided a lot of help for soldiers returning after the war. They didn't want to live with their parents anymore. They wanted to own their own homes, have their own slice of the American dream, so to speak. And so the VA provided assistance along with the FHA to veterans so that they could own their own homes. And this is when we really see a massive population boom in Johnson County. So in 1940, just before the war, the population of the county was 33,000, a little more than 33,000. World War II happens, 1950, the population has almost doubled to 62,000. Within 10 more years, in 1960, it's more than doubled to 143,000. These are staggering numbers. This is that agricultural land, those dairies, those truck farms that we were talking about, being turned into neighborhoods like you see here. So the neighborhood that you see here is part of Prairie Village. Really booming after World War II. And we see this population boom, this housing boom in Johnson County for one main reason. Whereas before the war, they were constructing 7 to 10 houses a year with craftsmen. During the war, something really new had happened. There was prefabrication. As military installations were moving along the front in Europe and in Asia, things needed to be built and unbuilt and reassembled, right, many times. Housing for soldiers, mess halls, medical supplies, medical tents and things. And so after the war, that prefabrication comes back to the civilian sector. And in Prairie Village specifically, one of J.C. Nichols' developments, they're completing one home per day in a 23-step process. Simplified home building, made it so that anybody could build that house. It was all prefab, it was all pre-measured. You just assembled it, put some nails in, and you were done with the house. As we're talking about the suburbanization of Johnson County, one thing that's really important to talk about is the history of redlining. This mainly took place in Kansas City, Missouri, but it impacted Johnson County in so many ways, so many very important ways. And so the map that you see here was called a residential security map. It's also called a redlining map. The FHA, that Federal Housing Administration, and the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, were created at roughly the same time in the 1930s. And in trying to put more Americans into houses, they decided to codify neighborhoods. And so we see 4 different colors here. Sometimes they're called first, second, third, fourth. Sometimes they're called A, B, C, D. Green is the newest neighborhood. What it would mean is it's a homogeneous neighborhood. All white is what that means. Typically brand new homes. Blue would be still new, a little slightly older. Yellow is older homes that are falling into disrepair. Still an all-white neighborhood though. That's the important differentiation between yellow and red. When you get into red-lined neighborhoods or red-shaded neighborhoods, this is where you start to see minority populations. In Kansas City, mainly African Americans. On the west side, eventually it would become redlined because of Latinos. In other places like New York City, you might see Jewish populations thrown into the mix. In places like San Francisco, you would have redlined Asian American communities, and so any minority population, any population that wasn't white, was typically redlined. And what the HOLC said was these neighborhoods that are in red and the ones that are in yellow, about to become red, were not insurable for mortgages. You couldn't issue a mortgage insurance there because the homes would decrease in value. And so it was a risky investment for the bank. And so as the FHA and the HOLC went through and codified these neighborhoods, they exempted people from being able to take advantage of the FHA programming. They put out basically a blanket statement that said that African Americans could not participate in the FHA programming in these new mortgage terms. Any neighborhood like Prairie Village that was built with FHA funding as an entire subdivision, they were not able to purchase a home there. And so this is the federal government dictating who and who cannot participate in suburbanization. This is also happening on the individual contractor and real estate developer level as well. Deed restrictions, sometimes called racial covenants like the one we see here, this is from Leawood Estates in the 1950s. These were on individual properties, a deed restriction. And this one very clearly says no portion of this land shall be sold, leased, rented, used, owned, occupied by any person of the Negro blood, any person who is Jewish, Persian, Arabian. If you were in Dallas, it would say Hispanic or Latino. If you were in San Francisco, again, it would say Asian. New York City or New Jersey, Jewish would be pretty explicit in there. And so this governed a single property. So what J.C. Nichols did, he said, you know, this isn't good enough on individual properties. Let's apply it to an entire neighborhood, like Mission Hills or Prairie Village. He started homes associations. And so when he created this entire subdivision, he created a series of laws that went along with it that governed the entire neighborhood as a homes association. And to purchase a piece of land here in Mission Hills, you would have to sign off on those laws to be able to even purchase there. And one of those laws was almost always something like the deed restriction you see here. No African American can purchase here. Some neighborhoods, no Jewish families can purchase here. Right along with other things like you can't paint your house purple, you can't have a goat shed in the backyard, and you have to have, you know, a 20-foot setback from the road to your front door. And this was just in this, that's why you see this number here. It was just in a list of rules that governed your property. So redlining, in Kansas City created what they called white flight. And so these newer neighborhoods that you see down here, people were moving out of these neighborhoods because they were afraid they couldn't get mortgage insurance anymore. And so they moved south in Kansas City and eventually moved across the state line, fleeing white flight, areas that were redlined, and so typically areas that were African American and other minority populations. And so this process, from the federal government to individual contractors and real estate developers, really drove the population that you see in Johnson County. And that's why when we're in 1980 for our population census, we still see about 96, 97% white population. Even in 2010, the last census, it was 87%. So this long history of white flight, redlining, deed restrictions has led to the population and the types of neighborhoods that we see in Johnson County today. We've talked about a lot of different things, a lot of different historical eras and events and people in Johnson County's history today, but I really want to encourage you to come in and see the museum for yourself. Take a guided tour or go through at your own pace. There's so many more stories to tell here, so many more things to learn, a lot of nostalgia, and a lot of really important history. Thanks for listening, and we hope we see you soon.